Dr. Flanagan wanted to discuss the new National Energy Program, but to preface the conversation, he returned to the first National Energy Program, which is generally stated to start in 1981. But in fact, it began much before that, as he explained that some of these measures went back to 1974, when there was a price spike in oil prices globally, and there was a spike in 1973 and in 1979. So these were modifications of an earlier program. Between 1974 and 1986, the main theme was that world oil prices were high, so the government was trying to protect the mass majority of Canadians who live in Ontario and Quebec, where a lot of oil was being imported. And secondly, at the time, the federal government, with the national energy policy, was trying to get control of the industry and to take part of the wealth from the industry and divert it to the feds. So the main goals were price controls on exports, and the federal government at the time was helping itself to the differential, on the price differential between Canadian oil and the world oil price. They had a number of export taxes, and there was a transfer of wealth to the federal government. And at that time, Petro-Canada was also created. So an awful lot of money was spent, and an awful lot of investment money left Canada.
An awful lot of money was spent. An awful lot of investment was driven out of Canada. The Mulroney government campaigned against it when they ran in 1984 and they were elected. They said they would dismantle the National Energy Program, and they did. It took a couple of years, but they finally did. They sold off Petro-Canada, they got rid of the price controls, they got rid of the special taxes, and we went back to more or less the way things had been. Anyway, the main theme here, the senior Trudeau and his National Energy Program was not against the industry as such. They saw, he and his advisors saw the oil industry as a source of unprecedented wealth because of the increase in oil prices. And they wanted to get their hands on the wealth. They didn't want to destroy the industry. I mean, they almost did, but that wasn't their intention. Their intention was to redirect the industry and to get control of the wealth for what they saw as national purposes. So it was fundamentally a cash grab, but it wasn't an attempt to destroy the industry. It ended in complete failure. As I said, it was everything was reversed. There were unsustainable deficits subsidizing all this oil for consumers, proved to be unbearably expensive. There was disinvestment. Companies leaving Canada for greener fields, Petro-Canada boondoggle, spending, again, many of you will remember they were paying inflated prices for other companies, and they weren't finding oil that they could profitably develop in the north anyway. So it was a moment in history which was finally ended in 1986. But even as it was ending, the seeds of the next National Energy Program were being laid, as it were. Maybe I'm mixing metaphors. I don't know if you can lay a seed, but plant a seed, I guess. I mean, even in his first term, Brian Mulroney was talking about the Rio conference, Rio de Janeiro. This was the beginning of the public concern about carbon dioxide. Jean Chrétien is kind of an important transitional figure in this. On the one hand, Chrétien signed the Kyoto Accord in 1997, which was supposed to lead to massive reductions in carbon dioxide emissions. He had no plan for living up to it, and in fact, emissions continued to increase quite markedly afterwards. And also, what's really kind of interesting is that Chrétien was the one that kick-started or jump-started the oil sands. It was an agreement about the same time as he was signing the Kyoto Accord. His government reached an agreement with Ralph Klein's government in Alberta to reduce royalty rates on oil sands products on the provincial side, and on the federal side they changed the tax code to facilitate investment tax credits for investment. You could write them off more quickly. So the combination of lower royalty and better tax treatment really drove the oil sands forward. I mean, obviously there had been production there before, but the big boom comes afterwards. And so what do we make out of the green movement of the day? Well, I think on the part of the politicians, it was mainly posturing. They wanted to say these things. They really had no clear idea of how they would do it. Maybe didn't even take it very seriously. It's like dozens of other things the politicians might say that were said mainly for public effect. But there were consequences from the growth of the green movement, and those started to bear down upon us here in Alberta before too long. Now, I want to show you a few slides from a meeting which was held in summer of 2008, sponsored by the Rockefeller Foundation in the United States, although there was Canadian participation in it as well. The deck of slides was sent to me years ago by Ezra Levant, a former student of mine. I'm not sure where he got them. And I'm not even sure how the meeting was conducted, whether everybody was there or whether some of it was done by teleconference. I don't know. But anyway, there's a big deck of slides, like several dozen of them. I'm not going to show all of them, but I'm going to show a few that highlight the strategic thinking of this meeting. So the participants in the meeting, which was, again, organized by the Rockefeller Foundation, were mainly people from other foundations. And it was an attempt to coordinate the donor activity of foundations to reduce the scope of the oil industry, ultimately to euthanize it so that oil would be replaced by alternative sources of energy. And they chose the oil sands as the first target. Now, up to this time, the oil sands, they were there and they were growing, but they weren't widely known. I remember must have been 2004, I was invited down to Washington for an all-day seminar to give information to the newly appointed ambassador to the United States. The State Department organizes these sessions, I guess, I don't know if they do it for ambassadors to all countries, but they did it for the new ambassador to Canada. And so there were experts, so-called, of various kinds, academics and others that were invited, and we made presentations, and Ambassador Salucci, sat there and took notes and asked questions. I remember one of the so-called experts, he was a Canadian, although he was teaching in the United States. And I remember him saying, well, and they do Canada has oil, and they have the oil sands, but it's not a big deal. And this would be 2004, and I said, well, it's a bigger deal than you may think. But my point is that in 2004, even otherwise well-informed people, unless they were working in the oil sands, were not really aware of the scope of what was going on and the magnitude of the achievement up there. But after 2008, after these people decided to put on a concerted campaign to demonize the oil sands, they started to come to the fore in people's consciousness. So let's look at some slides here. So raise the negatives, that means demonize the oil sands, raise the cost, slow down and stop infrastructure, in other words, block pipelines, enroll key decision makers, build political support. Okay, next one. So they called it the tar sands campaign. Again, it's kind of funny, when I moved here 50 years ago, tar sands was the normal word for what we now call the oil sands. I mean, everybody knew it wasn't tar, but that was the historical term. And then along the way, somebody said, well, we'll get better publicity if we call it the oil sands. So we all switched to oil sands, but then the enemies said we should go back to the term tar sands. So they chose that deliberately. So they actually call it the tar sands campaign, and you can go on Wikipedia and find articles about the tar sands campaign. It's become a well-known phrase. So short-term, change the debate. That means, I say, demonize the tar sands. Mid-term, get a moratorium on new production, which is kind of where we are now. and long-term, something other than oil to use for energy. So track 1, stop, limit pipelines and refinery expansions. Well, you've seen the success of that. Look at the pipeline proposals that are out for product from Alberta, which have been stopped either permanently or temporarily. In some cases, we're not sure yet, but Northern Gateway, Energy East never really got off the ground, although a lot of money was spent on it. Keystone XL is being held up in the American courts. My guess is that it probably will win in court, but if it doesn't win in court before the next election, and if the Democrats get a new president, then he will probably kill that pipeline too. We'll have to wait and see. Trump is about the only friend we have outside of Alberta, so I have to hope that this gets done before he leaves office. I mean, I don't know if he'll leave office in next election or not, but it's a possibility, obviously, every time there's an election. Trans Mountain, well, you all know what happened to Trans Mountain. So we're left with Line 3, which is just refurbishing an existing pipeline, getting it back to its original capacity. So they've been pretty successful in stopping pipelines. Refinery expansions, I really don't know much about that. Alberta's not a big refining province, so I haven't studied refineries, but pipelines, they clearly have been successful. Okay, next one. Track 2, part of the demonization of the oil sands, publicize things like how ugly it all is if you're looking at the open pit mines. Of course, all open pit mines are kind of ugly, no matter what you're mining. And they don't focus on the fact that half the production today is from SAGD, which the footprint is almost invisible. But they just show pictures of the open pit, and they don't show the reclaimed areas. They show the active areas, and they talk about birds that may run afoul of this. Okay, next. Reduce the future demand for tar sands oil. So that's part of demonizing it around the world, getting countries to say we won't accept this, we won't buy it, we won't let it cross our borders. And that's been very successful in British Columbia. It's not another country exactly, although maybe we should consider it as one. But that's really the game changer for us in British Columbia. Notice that they're still exporting huge amounts of coal to Asia. I guess all or most of it's dug up in British Columbia, but they're exporting it for British Columbia. And they've just approved this huge liquefied natural gas export plan, which involves construction of a major new pipeline. But oil has been demonized because it includes bitumen from the oil sands, and that really is what has made all the difference. So a lot of the First Nations, which have been opposed to any bitumen pipeline, have signed on to the natural gas pipeline. So anyway, that's part of the plan. Go ahead. Policy victories, and certainly there have been many of those. Say, for example, President Obama refusing to approve Keystone XL, keeping it alive for 7 years, and then vetoing it at the end. That's just one example, but there have been many. Go ahead. And the fuels end game, well, that means shutting down the oil and ultimately the gas industry as well, and replacing it with wind and sunshine. Okay, so these are the general themes. So then they talked about campaign structure. They have a U.S. coordinator and a Canadian coordinator. Campaign groups, people working on policy and trying to affect demand, infrastructure, communications. Steering committee, coordinators, fundraisers. Tides, you've probably read about the impact of the Tides Foundation and the way that they have funded anti-energy activities in Canada. They do it in the United States too, but we're more aware of what they do in Canada. Go ahead. So budget $7 million a year, but that's just for starters. Then many other foundations have gotten on board. They talk about legal suits, and they've been able to use litigation very effectively for stopping, delaying or stopping pipelines. The ones I mentioned, there's a litigation side to most of them. Now, who's paying for that litigation? I mean, how is the West Coast Legal Defense Fund, or what the exact title, how are they able to have a staff of 18 lawyers and sue everybody in sight, mostly working for First Nations who don't have much money of their own? Somebody's paying the bills. Well, the money, it's almost impossible to trace because it's a mixture of American and Canadian Foundation money. The American foundations pass it to the Canadian foundations. Canadian foundations make donations to law firms, First Nations, advocacy groups, who in turn may then pass it on further. You know, it's like the delta of a big river where it's all braided. You never be able to trace all the channels. But the money is flowing, and so it supports litigation, and it supports all the other organizing activities, you know, the protest demonstrations that you see, lobbying, and so on. Okay, next. And then we get the Canadian portion of it, and here the speaker was one of the senior people from our friends at the Pembina Institute, who have always posed as an impartial purveyor of information about the environment, but in fact here they are taking part in organizing a campaign to shut down the oil industry. Okay, go through. This is pretty much a repetition. It just says who the Pembina Institute is, what they have done in the past. Okay, go ahead. And that doesn't matter, some polling data. But this is just kind of background for Canada, because for the Americans might not be aware of it. But again, the goals are the same: stop pipelines and refinery expansions, demonize the tar sands by talking about environmental impact, reduce demand for oil, calling it dirty oil, and you know, all this stuff. If it's all the same as the larger agenda of the organization, of the whole campaign. Okay, so that's probably enough. That gives you the picture that, so for the last 10 years, what has happened to your industry is, and I say you're, maybe not everybody works in the energy industry, but even if you work elsewhere, your business is probably dependent upon the energy industry, because that's what's going on here. You know, we've been the target of a deliberate campaign. It's organized, deliberate, well-funded campaign to put a cap on the activities of the energy industry and ultimately to shut it down completely. That's the longer range goal, and we've had statements by the Prime Minister of Canada, for example, endorsing that, you know, ultimately, eventually we will replace the oil industry, et cetera, et cetera. So I didn't bring along the quotes, they're too depressing. So the developments you're all familiar with, they're really hitting us here in Alberta, the blockage of pipelines, I've talked about that. New taxes, carbon tax, that's part of the plan. Make oil and other products, similar products, more expensive. Regulatory limitations, for example, the oil sands, the emissions cap on the oil sands, 100 million something or other. Megatons. So I'm not an engineer, but it's 100 something. That cap is high enough that right now it's not preventing anybody from producing, but it's a terrible signal to potential investors that this is an area where you're not going to be able to keep progressing. And so we have seen the departure, as you all know, the departure of the big internationals from the oil sands. They've been divesting themselves of investments and, you know, selling them to whoever will buy. All accompanied by the rise of social license ideology. Again, our Prime Minister, one of his quotations that, how does it go? Governments can give permission, but only communities can give consent, or something like that. But in practice, social license means deference to the loudest voice. There's no clear definition of which community has to give its consent. I mean, you see a good example of this last week in the blockade over the Morris River for the Coastal GasLink pipeline. TransCanada negotiated mutual benefit agreements with 20 First Nations along the route, But in the Wet'suwet'en First Nation, they have an elected council as well as traditional chiefs and clans and houses and so on. Well, the elected council gave its consent to an agreement and has pocketed already several $1 million in advance payments. But people in the other government structure were opposed to it. So they're the ones who set up the blockade. Now, the blockade's been taken down, for the time being at least. The workers can get to the pipeline site and they can do construction, but that's only because in this one instance, the provincial government actually wants that pipeline to be built. Think what would have happened if the provincial government of BC had meddled in this as they did in Trans Mountain. What if they had supported the Wet'suwet'en dissidents? What if they had encouraged them to bring litigation challenging the injunction and funded it? Well, all these things happened in the case of Trans Mountain. This would have delayed, for sure, construction of the pipeline for months, and might have even blocked it. I mean, you can never really predict, since the whole law of consultation has been made up by the courts in the last less than 25 years. Much of it is undefined. Nobody knows really what adequate consultation is or isn't. But in this particular instance, the government of British Columbia wanted this one pipeline to be built. But it shows how fragile the whole thing is, that it might have been held up and maybe even derailed indefinitely by one fraction of one First Nation under the heading of social license. You know, you can't go through here because we don't give our consent. So anyway, who's part of this? Well, this is a multifaceted onslaught against the oil sands and the energy industry in general. The first National Energy Program was really just the Federal Liberal Party. But this is much broader. This is the federal government with its carbon tax and its blocking of Northern Gateway and Energy East, and bringing in Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines Act. It's also been local politicians, the NDP, which in British Columbia for sure, but initially in Alberta, but Premier Notley has seen, once she got into office, that she had no future political career if she was complicit in destroying our major industry. So she has somewhat switched sides and has now become an advocate for pipelines and is not condemning the industry as much as the NDP once did. But then you have all the other non-political party activists as well. The environmental organizations, the First Nations, and allied social activist groups. So the second National Energy Program is going to be much harder to beat back than the first. The first one could be beaten back ultimately by a change of power in Ottawa. It just took one election, a victory by a party that had seen what was happening and wanted to reverse it, and it could be done. This one, you've got politicians in Ottawa, but in the provinces as well, who are doing the best to block our exports of our products. You have activists influencing public opinion and working in the courts, and this is very difficult because the duty to consult, which was invented by the Supreme Court in 2004, as I said, is not well defined, and it can be used to hold up almost anything if you've got money to pay the lawyers. And you're going to see this with respect to Trans Mountain. You know, there's a new, the Federal Court of Appeal in its decision pinpointed two areas where it said that consultation had been insufficient. And so the federal government said, okay, we're going to do what the court, we're not going to appeal, we're going to do what the court says, and we're going to do the consultation better. So we're going to have a do-over in these selected areas, and that's what's going on right now. But the appeals against the do-over are already being prepared. The opponents will be back in court as soon as the new reports come down, because these people, they don't actually want consultation in order to have their ideas be heard and accepted. To them, consultation is a weapon. They've weaponized consultation. It is the way in which they stop the pipeline. And this is possible to do under this blurry jurisprudence of the duty to consult, which the courts have created. There's kind of no internal limitations on it, so you keep going back. Consultation 1, you don't like it, you go to court. Consultation 2, you don't like that, you go back to court. So, Trans Mountain, well, I like to say I'm a conservative, so I'm never optimistic, I'm always hopeful. Will we see shovels in the ground, as they say, in 1919? I'm hopeful but not optimistic, because I think that the same people will be back in court. And, you know, then the appeals come. They go to the Federal Court of Appeal, and then from there possibly Supreme Court of Canada. I mean, you know, this could drag on for quite a long time. Anyway, it's not a hopeful picture. I guess but what I'm leaving you with is how difficult this is, that the first National Energy Program could be overturned by a political victory. But this one is so multifaceted that it can't be overturned by any single political victory. I mean, that would be helpful. To get a more sympathetic government in Ottawa would be helpful. To get a more sympathetic government in Edmonton would be helpful. But the enemies of the industry have conquered so many beachheads and outposts around us that, you know, Premier Kenny, if it's going to be Premier Kenny, he can't really do very much about an appeal in British Columbia based on insufficient consultation with First Nations. That becomes a judicial issue. It's you know, it's out of his control. We could cut off all the oil to British Columbia. It might be satisfying to do, drive the price of gasoline up to $2 or $3 a liter. You know, I'd enjoy that, I guess, looking at it. But it actually won't address the problem, because the legal challenge to Trans Mountain from the British Columbia government has been beaten back in the courts. They did not win that. But that's not what's holding it up. What's holding it up is the legal challenge from First Nations. So cutting off all the oil to British Columbia in general will just make new enemies for Alberta, but won't actually change the behavior of the smaller number of strategically located people that are running the opposition right now. So anyway, it's not an optimistic talk, unfortunately.
Yeah, pretty bleak prospect.
Yeah, but you know, I've lived long enough to know that things do change sometimes. Things look pretty bleak in the middle of the National Energy Program too. I can remember, just as a personal anecdote to end the talk, in 1981 we decided we needed more living space. We were in a condominium, we needed to buy a house. It was absolutely the wrong time. So we bought a new house, first mortgage at 14%, a second mortgage at 17%, and we kept our condo as an investment on the advice of people I wrongly respected. And so we took an equity takeout mortgage at 21%. It all seems inconceivable now, but it's just an illustration of how things can change. So maybe something will happen that will change this, but as I look at it right now, it is extremely difficult to roll back, because of the, it's not just a single political victory that can change it. Happy to take questions on this or related topics.
I had a question. Assuming that there's a change of government in Alberta, there'll be a central block of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario that are against the CO2 tax, and what sort of effect do you think that block would have fighting the federal government or changing policy?
Well, yeah, there's actually probably more. It's Manitoba's on side with the challenge too. So yeah, from Alberta through Ontario and maybe Newfoundland. There's certainly, and New Brunswick for sure. So yeah, there will be court, but this again, it's going to be fought out in the courts. It becomes a jurisdictional issue. Who has the power to levy a carbon tax? Federal government or or the provincial government. How the courts will decide this, I have no idea. I'm not an expert in this field. I've read people who are experts arguing on both sides. So I don't know what will happen. Politically, it could lead to something. I mean, there's two tracks here. There's the judicial track and the political track. I see it as in military terms, it's an important engagement, test of strength. But will it lead to repeal of all carbon taxes? You know, because there are many provincial governments that want to do something like that anyway, even if the federal government isn't doing it. So it's an engagement in a much longer war. It reminds me of a joke I heard shortly after I moved to Canada about you know, whether it's provincial or federal jurisdiction. So the joke is, imagine an international boarding school in Switzerland or someplace, and there are students there from all countries, and the teacher assigns to write an essay on elephants. And the American boy comes back with an essay entitled, you know, How to Raise Bigger and Better Elephants. And the French boy hands in a paper entitled Les Amours des éléphants. And the German boy hands in an essay entitled Elephants, a Brief Introduction in 4 volumes. And Canadian students, his title is Elephants, a Federal or Provincial Question. So we keep coming back to these federalism issues. Again, this will take a long time. No matter who wins the trial, there will be appeals. This is going to go on for certainly past the next provincial and federal elections. Sorry, you had
No,
questions.
it's okay. I was just wondering if you've